She folded the handkerchief carefully, embroidering each letter of his name by hand, as if she were writing a secret with the tip of her soul. It was just a piece of white cloth, but for her, it was a promise. He smiled when she appeared, but never in public. He loved her in silence behind the curtains of the house where she cleaned up the remains of his family's dinner. The handkerchief was ready the day he told her, with his eyes downcast, that he was going to get married. She didn't cry. She simply gave him the gift. At the altar he carried the handkerchief in his pocket, without noticing the embroidery, and when he took it out to wipe his face at the reception, someone pointed it out. "There's something written here." Too late. The bride saw it, she saw it, and the handkerchief fell from her hand before the tears fell. No one knew what she felt at that moment, when she saw what had been done with her tenderness. The handkerchief, which had once been sewn with love and silence, became a sweatcloth at a party that didn't include her. He used it as if it were anything. She returned home with the simple dress, her heart torn and her eyes dry, because she learned from an early age that a poor woman has no right to cry for a rich man, only to be grateful for being remembered. But fate, or perhaps time itself, decided to remember what he had forgotten, and years later, the same handkerchief, already aged, would be found among old papers. Only now, the woman who embroidered it was another. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. She realized that the handkerchief was ready at the same moment that her heart was no longer there. It was a cloudy morning, one of those when the sky seems to hold back the tears that we pretend to swallow. She had woken up before the sun, as always. The alarm clock was her own body, tired of waiting for miracles. The house was still asleep when she put the kettle on, tied up her hair, and spread the cloth on the kitchen table of her boss's. A simple white cloth, bought with the change from the lunch boxes she had skipped. She had saved up in her own dreams to buy that piece of pure fabric. She wanted to embroider his initials, not to be seen, but to leave hidden there, between the threads and stitches, the feeling that she dared not declare. Because between them, there had never been words, only silence, kindness, and glances that lasted longer than they should. He was kind. He always was, but too kind to everyone. With her, he smiled more. He asked simple things. "Did you sleep well? Have you had coffee?" As if they had some value, and for her they did. It was in these details that she wove her hope. She didn't expect him to give up everything for her, but she wanted him to know, to feel, to see how loyal she was, how, even though she was invisible in that house, she carefully embroidered the name he wore with pride. She was part of the backstage. She set the table for his rich friends, polished the silverware, cleaned the mirror in which the bride saw herself, without knowing that her dress had also passed through the hands of the girl who loved him silently. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, knowing that she touched everything that was hers, but would never be hers. That day, she embroidered the letter J, as if she were drawing her own pain. Then came the T, and each stitch hurt, because she already knew. They had already announced the wedding. The bride's name was everywhere. The whole house smelled of celebration, white flowers, and rich promises. She pretended not to see, but she did. And yet she kept going. You sewed until the last stitch. And when you finished, you folded the handkerchief slowly, put it in a small recycled paper envelope, and left it on his desk, like someone leaving a note that doesn't expect a reply. The next day he didn't say anything, but she saw it. She saw the pocket of his white jacket slightly bulging, and she also saw that he looked away when she passed by. It wasn't the same look anymore. It was as if he was saying, without words, "I shouldn't have." And she understood. It hurt, but she understood. She went back to the back room with dry eyes, but her heart on fire. She picked up a new needle, sewed up her own silence, and prepared to watch the wedding, as if she were just another invisible maid in the crowd. But she didn't know that destiny had other threads to embroider in this story, and that not everything that is despised remains forgotten. It was hard for her to explain why she kept going, Maybe because love, when born in silence, has deeper roots than reason can reach. She never intended to dream so high, but he made her forget for a few moments the hard ground her feet were on. All he had to do was smile. All he had to do was give her a disguised compliment, a glass of water carefully handed to her, a whispered request to stay a little longer after work because the house is so empty today. And she stayed. Even though she knew nothing was said, everything was felt. She believed in those pauses, those seconds when the whole world seemed to shrink until it fit just the two of them, a time when the difference between boss and employee disappeared. She was deluded, but with dignity. She never went beyond her limits. She never wanted to invade what wasn't hers. She just wanted a gesture that confirmed that what she felt wasn't just hers. Her mother used to say that poor women shouldn't get attached to rich men, that we're not born for the same kind of ending, that our boss's dreams are too big to fit people like us. But she thought that love was an exception, that love might not look at the balance on the bank account or the tiles in the bathroom, that maybe, just maybe, he saw her, not because of her worn-out clothes or her stained apron, but because of the way she listened to him, how she remembered the way he liked his coffee, the color of his favorite tie, the childhood stories he only told when no one else was around. She thought that was love, or something very close, enough to hurt. And it hurt. It hurt every time she saw the gaping difference between their worlds. When his friends came over, she hid behind the kitchen door. When she heard loud laughter coming from the living room, she washed the dishes harder, as if the sound of the water could erase the feeling that she didn't belong. And yet the next day, she was the one who made coffee. She was the one who straightened his shirt collar when he left in a hurry. She was the one who held his coat so he wouldn't be late. She was the one who stayed, until the day she accidentally overheard the conversation between his mother and his older sister. They were in the garden, drinking tea. She was going to serve toast. She stopped behind the curtain when she heard his name. "He's been very distracted lately. Is it because of the maid?" The other one responded with a dry laugh. "Oh, Mom, that's just a whim. He's kind to everyone. Poor people always confuse politeness with love." His mother laughed. "Yes, these girls are fooled by little. They think a look is a marriage proposal." And they laughed, both of them, while she, on the other side of the cloth, held the tray as if holding her own broken heart. She didn't cry. Not then. She went to the back room, locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there motionless. The handkerchief wasn't finished yet, but in that moment she knew that the embroidery was no longer for him. It was for her, to say goodbye to what never began, to sew the end of an illusion with the thread of her own pride. And yet she would continue, because her love never needed a stage. A stitch was enough, a piece of cloth, and a name she swore to forget. But she still embroidered. She went back to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Her eyes were too calm, and the silence was longer than usual. He noticed. He asked if everything was okay, and she just nodded, with that half smile of someone who has learned to survive from the inside. It was a clear morning. The garden was in bloom. The guests were starting to show up more often at the house. The wedding preparations were in full swing. She was cleaning the silverware while she heard the excited voices of the bride and her friends in the background, choosing flowers, trying out lipstick shades, rehearsing poses for photos that would last a lifetime. And there she was, an invisible witness to the joy of a woman who had no idea that another woman was crying inside for loving the same man. It was on that day that the wedding dress arrived. She herself was the one who received the box from the seamstress. It was large, heavy, wrapped in white ribbons and scented paper. The bride asked for help opening it. And there she was, on her knees on the floor of the hardwood closet, taking the dress out of the plastic while the rich girl twirled in front of the mirror, dreaming big, not realizing that the floor she was standing on was wet with tears that had never been seen. She ran her hand over the fabric carefully, felt the embroidery between her fingers, and wondered if something so beautiful had ever been made for her. The bride commented, "You have light hands. You have a knack for sewing." And she, just smiled, not knowing whether to thank her or apologize for being there. She felt ashamed for imagining that dress on herself, a thought that, for her, was already a sin. That night, he finished the handkerchief. The J and the T were ready. Then, on impulse, he also embroidered the day she met him, small in the corner, like someone signing a letter that will never be sent. He folded the fabric, ironed it, and put it in a little jewelry box. She sat there, looking at the gift that would never actually be given, but that somehow represented everything she had been and could not be. And she thought, will he understand? Will you remember? Will you even notice? But the answer came too soon. At the end of that week, he arrived home with his fiancée, holding hands, and he introduced her to the household staff one by one. When it was her turn, he didn't look her in the eye. He simply said, "This is the lady who takes care of everything around here. Trust her." The fiancée smiled. Politely, she said, "Nice to meet you." And in that moment he knew for sure. He chose not to see. He erased everything. Or maybe he never felt it. That night she cried for the first time, but it wasn't a loud cry. It was a pent-up sob, muffled in the thin cotton pillow between the seams of her uniform and the tears hidden in her collar. The handkerchief was on the nightstand. She didn't want to give it away anymore, but she couldn't throw it away either. It was a part of her that needed to exist, even if only she knew about it, even if no one ever used it. But fate, with its silent stubbornness, hadn't yet ended this story, because scorned love sometimes comes back, and not always in the way we expect. The next day she woke up earlier than usual, her heart heavy as if she had spent the night sewing her own mourning. He made the coffee as usual, lined up the glasses with almost military precision, and served the warm bread in the linen basket. It was the breakfast of formal introduction of the bride to her family. All eyes were on her, the future wife, the woman who would have the surname and the salons, the birthdays, the Christmas presents, the portraits hanging on the walls. And she was still there, in the shadows of the white columns of the house, serving tea with trembling hands. She avoided looking, but she did look, and when their eyes met, he looked away. Quickly, as if he had touched a secret he could no longer carry. It was then that she understood. That he was afraid of feeling, afraid of being seen feeling, afraid of someone noticing that there was an extra gesture, a different silence when she was around. His shame hurt her more than any absence, because we accept absence. Shame, we don't. It hurt to see how he tried to keep his distance, as if hiding was the best way to erase what was already recorded. But he didn't know that she didn't need declarations, that she had already memorized the way he held the cup, the way he frowned. When he thought too much, the tone of his voice when he was tired. She knew more about him than the bride who was there, smiling without knowing. And even so, she wasn't hers. That same afternoon, while tidying the rooms, she found one of his coats thrown over the armchair. She took the handkerchief out of the box, hesitated for a few seconds, and carefully placed it in her inside pocket. It wasn't a gesture of revenge. It was a farewell. It was the last breath of someone who had loved in silence for too long. If he saw it, he would see it. If he didn't, too bad. She didn't expect anything more. She just wanted to end the cycle with the dignity of someone who embroiders memories that no one else wants to carry. On the wedding day, she was asked to work at the reception as usual. She didn't feel strong enough, but she went. She put on her light blue uniform, combed her hair carefully, and put on lipstick for the first time in weeks. She needed to look her best, even if it was just on the outside. And there she was, standing in the corner of the decorated ballroom, watching the guests arrive with their expensive perfumes and shiny dresses. He walked past her. He was handsome, nervous, and with his handkerchief in his pocket. She saw it. He saw her too. And for a moment, the world stopped. But he didn't say anything. He didn't even smile. He just walked on. During the ceremony, she stood behind the columns, not daring to look directly at the altar. But she heard the vows, the I do, the applause, the music. She listened to it all with a heavy heart, like someone watching the end of a movie that never started. And there, in that silence, she decided that she would never return to that house again. Not the next day, not the next month. Never again. Because the love she felt didn't fit there anymore. But before he left, he had one last moment. A moment he had not foreseen. Something that fate prepared with cruelty and beauty at the same time. And that would change everything. The wedding reception was held in the garden of the house, among illuminated trees and tables covered with small candles that flickered in the night breeze. Soft music mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the smiles of those celebrating the perfect union, at least from the outside. She walked between the tables, collecting plates and filling glasses, invisible as always, but not like before. Now, there was a concrete pain in her, which was no longer waiting. Or hope. It was the end. And yet her gestures were delicate. Her posture was erect. Her silence was respectful. No one there could imagine what was in the groom's pocket, not even him. That was when one of the groomsmen, already drunk from the wine, joked loudly, "Hey, JT, lend me that handkerchief. I'm sweating like I'm the groom." Everyone laughed. He laughed too, without thinking. He took the handkerchief out of his pocket and held it out. His friend, upon opening it, frowned. "Wait. There's something written on this. Look." The bride, curious, came closer. She picked up the fabric lightly and read the embroidered initials in a low voice. Then she turned the piece over and saw in the corner a small date embroidered with blue thread. The date he met another woman. The one who was there a few meters away, collecting empty glasses with hands that were too steady for a moment like this. The silence that fell around that table lasted for seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. When he realized what he was holding, he stood still. His eyes scanned the room, restless until they found her. She, who was looking at him for the first time that night. There was no pain, no resentment in her eyes, just a silent farewell. An end that was being sewn together by itself in front of everyone. The bride didn't understand, but she understood. She put the handkerchief in her purse and continued to smile, but with her lips tighter. The groom didn't have the courage to explain himself. He just lowered his head, like someone confronted by a truth that he pretended didn't exist. She then walked towards the exit. No one stopped her. No one held her gaze. Not even his. She walked through the flower-filled hallway, past the porcelain vases, past the portraits on the wall. She picked up her simple bag, left her uniform folded on the chair, and left. With the same ease with which she had entered that house years ago, carrying only a notebook, a change of clothes, and her heart wide open to the world that awaited her. On the street, the wind touched her face as if to say it was time. She didn't cry. She had already cried everything inside, and now each step was a new stitch in the embroidery of her own story. She knew that from then on she would have to start over, and she would start over. Alone, but in peace. He just didn't imagine that that handkerchief, the one that fell from his hand like any other piece of cloth, would appear again, years later, in another place, in other hands. And this time, he would be the one looking for answers in the seams he never wanted to see. Time passed with a strange speed. The newspapers announced marriages, then children, and then a discreet divorce, hushed up by his family with silence and money. The wife he had chosen, beautiful, perfect, and admired, left without a sound. She claimed boredom. She said he was too cold, and maybe he was. Maybe because deep down, a part of him had never been there. Completely. The house became too big, the rooms empty. And he, who had previously lived surrounded by people, began to get used to the sound of solitary footsteps on the floor. He tried to fill himself with work, travel, parties that seemed happy in the photos but ended too soon. Nothing fixed, nothing healed. It was on a warm afternoon, years later, while he was organizing old papers in a forgotten box in his father's office, now deceased, that he found the handkerchief. It was among contracts, school notebooks, and unsent letters, folded with strange care. When he opened it, the world stopped. There were the embroidered letters, perfect, immortal, and in the corner, the date. That date. The day he had seen her for the first time, carrying a tray of coffee and a shy smile on her face. The memory came like a punch, her holding the handkerchief in the garden, her direct gaze, the absence of tears. It all made sense now, but too late. He sat down, handkerchief in hand, his eyes fixed on the sewing he had once despised. For the first time he saw what had always been there, the tenderness hidden between the stitches, the constant presence in the details of the house, the only person who truly looked at him without any interest other than being close, and he ignored her. He pretended not to see her. He felt shame, cowardice, pride, anything that would prevent him from recognizing what was now burning inside him. There was no going back, but there was weight. And with that weight, he decided to look for her, not out of regret, but out of honor, out of respect for the woman who had once silently embroidered what he had never had the courage to admit out loud. He asked about her at the old house. The new owners didn't know anything. He asked at the local church, at the public school where she had studied. It took days. A man at the market remembered. She sews. She went to a small town. She set up a studio. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. And he kept going. He traveled without telling anyone. He took the handkerchief in his pocket, and with it all the words he never said. When he arrived in the small, simple town, he felt out of place, but also lighter. The streets were narrow, with flowers in the windows and people greeting each other with their eyes. He asked about the seamstress. "You mean the girl who teaches you how to embroider phrases on handkerchiefs?" a lady said. He nodded, his heart beating fast for the first time in years. They showed him a discreet studio with an old-fashioned window and lace curtains. On the glass was a hand-embroidered phrase, "What is not said is sewn." He entered, slowly, and the sound of the door creaking was like the trigger of a dormant emotion. But she was not there. The one who greeted him was a young woman with sweet eyes, threads on her fingers, and a low voice. He hesitated, holding the handkerchief. He asked, "Does she still embroider?" The girl smiled. "Yes, she does. But now, she teaches other women to sew their pains." And she pointed to a box in the corner of the room. "There are the handkerchiefs she was unable to deliver. Some have a destiny, others only memories." He approached the box as if opening an old wound, and inside it, he would find more than he expected. He knelt before the box, as if he were standing before an altar. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't just from nervousness. It was from guilt. Guilt that had been accumulated, forgotten, buried under years of silence and pride. The girl from the studio respectfully stepped aside, as if she understood that there were stories that could only be read alone. Inside the box were dozens of folded handkerchiefs, tied with small ribbons of fabric, each with a tag hanging from a red thread. Some had names, others had dates, and some phrases. He ran his fingers over them carefully, as if each one were a piece of someone who had suffered in silence. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. Maybe his, maybe someone else's. But deep down he wanted to understand what that woman had done with the pain he had caused. The handkerchief he had found at home was still in his pocket, folded with precision. But now, seeing so many others there, he understood that it wasn't the only one she had embroidered. Only that one. That one was personal. It was unique. And she hadn't embroidered it for art. She had embroidered it for love. Love that had been rejected, hidden, swept under the rug of her own home. He picked up a random handkerchief. It read, "For those who never said it," but it stayed. The embroidery was firm, flawless, with a light blue line that seemed as soft as the tone of voice he remembered hers. Another said, "What I felt didn't need a response." And another, "I forgot myself to remember you." He read each one as if he were hearing her voice again, between the clatter of the cutlery and the silence of the hallways. And then, almost at the bottom of the box, he found a different one. The thread was gold, the fabric was thicker, and on the label his full name. His hands froze. He opened it slowly. The handkerchief was simple, elegant, and in the corner, the same handwriting stitched in as the first time. But now it said, "You pretended not to see. I learned to see on my own." He read it 3 times. The thread trembled between his fingers. The weight of those stitched words fell like a broken mirror on his chest. It wasn't hate. It was confirmation. It was liberation. And because of that, it hurt more. The girl noticed his emotion but didn't ask anything. She just offered him some tea and left him sitting there with the handkerchief on his lap and the teary eyes of someone who had lost something he never had the courage to hold on to. He wanted to know where she was, if she still lived in the city, if he could see her, talk to her, say anything. The girl shook her head. She doesn't receive visitors, but she lets the handkerchief speak for her. He understood, because now finally he heard. And what he heard was stronger than any excuse. He left the studio with the handkerchief in his hands and his heart in pieces. He walked through the narrow streets of the city with vague steps, as if he no longer knew where he fit. His eyes were red. His soul was silent. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to move on. He just wanted to understand where everything had gone wrong. The embroidered phrase echoed inside him like a sentence. "You pretended not to see. I learned to see on my own." And perhaps that was the great tragedy, having everything so close, and yet closing our eyes. He sat on a bench in the square, watching the boys playing ball barefoot, the ladies chatting in the shade, the smell of fresh bread coming from a modest bakery. Everything was so simple, so different from the world he had built, full of appearances, commitments, and dinners without affection. And there, in the middle of it all, he felt envious, not of other people's lives, but of the lightness she had chosen to live. He, with everything he had, still carried an emptiness he couldn't name. She, with so little, seemed to have embroidered meaning into her own wounds. He stayed there for hours, in silence, observing, thinking, reliving old scenes like someone rewinding a film, missing a forgotten detail. He remembered the first time he saw her, the coffee she served, the way she arranged the flowers on the table, her eyes that looked at him without demanding anything, just with presence, and he, so blinded by his own haste, didn't see that there was love there. A shy, silent, but firm love, like everything that truly lasts. As the sun began to set, he returned to the studio. The young woman was still there, arranging spools of thread and small paper patterns. He entered with the same reverence as before and asked hesitantly, "Will she be back here tomorrow?" The young woman smiled sweetly. "Maybe, but she never lets us know. Sometimes she shows up in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. It depends on the day, her mood, her memory." He wanted to leave something, a note, a letter, but he didn't know what to say, how to begin, how to apologize for years of silence. The young woman noticed his indecision and held out a piece of white cloth. She likes it when people embroider too, even if it's just a stitch. It's her way of hearing what hasn't been said. He held the fabric as if he had been given a second chance. He sat down at the small table in the back. The young woman taught him how to hold the needle and choose the thread, and with uncertain fingers he began. He sewed slowly, in silence, without rushing, as if each stitch were a sentence never said, as if finally he had learned to speak from the heart. When she finished, it was dark outside. She folded the handkerchief, placed it on the other people's box, and left. This time her shoulders felt lighter. Maybe there would be no reunion. Maybe she would never see him again. But now there was something of him hidden there, between the lines, in the right place, at the right time. That night he didn't sleep. He stayed at a modest inn in the city centre, the kind of place he would never have chosen in the past, but which now seemed the only suitable one. The room smelled of old wood and windows that creaked in the wind. He lay down on the narrow bed, with the cracked ceiling visible, and lay there, eyes open, listening to the sounds of the small town, the distant barking of a dog, the sound of the gate being locked, the breeze rustling the dry leaves of the tree leaning against the porch. And through it all, the embroidery he had done earlier remained pulsing in his mind. He had never imagined that a thread through cloth could heal such a deep part of him. The next day, he left early. He passed by the studio, but she wasn't there yet. The girl from the store recognized him, offered him coffee, and said that she sometimes took a long time. He thanked her but preferred to walk. He walked through the open-air market, the park, and the streets with crooked sidewalks. He saw a woman teaching children how to sew felt flowers in a public school, a boy playing the guitar on a park bench. And he understood right then that she had chosen a world where everything was made with hands and with truth. Late in the morning, he returned to the studio. The window was different. There were new scarves on display, and among them one, a unique one, with an embroidered phrase that had not been there the day before. Some eyes open late, but they still see. He stopped. His heart raced. This was for him. He knew. It was an answer, a sign, a gesture from someone who understood that he now saw. And even without words, she welcomed him, without promises, without going back, without bowing to the past, but with dignity, with lightness, like everything she had ever been. He went in. The young woman smiled, said nothing, just pointed to the box. He approached, and next to the handkerchief he had embroidered the day before, there was another, a small envelope made of recycled paper. He opened it. Inside, an old photo. She, still young, smiling shyly with her apron stained with paint, sitting on the floor of the old house sewing. On the back, a single handwritten sentence. "Thank you for coming back. I was whole, even without you." He sat down. He didn't cry, but his eyes filled with a softness he had never felt before. That was it. That was what he needed to hear. She didn't need him anymore, but still, she offered her peace, her healing, her silent way of transforming pain into beauty. And he understood that this was the end, not an end of absence, but of an answer. Their story would not begin again. It would have memory. It would have a handkerchief. It would have embroidery. At that moment he knew it was time to go back, not to the old house, not to the old world, but to life, with a different vision, with a different soul, and with the handkerchief in his pocket, as a living reminder of everything he didn't have the courage to live, and she had the strength to overcome. He returned to the big city, carrying less luggage than he had brought with him. He brought only a small suitcase, an embroidered scarf, and the certainty that he no longer needed to pretend. When he entered the house, everything seemed out of place: the expensive furniture, the immaculate walls, the empty hallways. Everything now had a hollow sound, an absence that could not be disguised. He ran his fingers over the framed family portraits, but he felt that none of the faces really knew him. For the first time, the house felt strange to him. It was no longer home, it was a setting. He no longer wanted the meeting room, the social dinners, the fake events. He asked to take time off work. He donated clothes. He closed his private office. He started walking to the market, sitting on park benches, chatting with neighbors he had barely greeted before. He discovered a local seamstress, and one random Saturday went in. He asked to learn. She thought it was strange. "Do you want to embroider?" He smiled. "I want to learn to say things I've never said." Weeks passed. He now knew how to fasten the thread, do a backstitch, and correct a crooked thread. He began to give people small embroidered cloths as gifts. Simple phrases: "Forgive me if I never listened to you," or "You are more than you." Imagine. And the most special of all, it took me a while, but I learned to see. He delivered it silently, without signing, as if he were sewing into the world what he had once failed to sew into a single woman. One morning he passed by a public school. He saw girls coming out with handkerchiefs in their hands, smiling. One of them was holding a cloth with the words, "You are worth more than what they hide from you." He stopped. He asked the employee where the embroidery came from. She replied, "It's from a beautiful project that started a few years ago. A woman came from the countryside and set up a group with students from the school system. They teach people how to embroider words, words that heal." He knew. He didn't need to hear the name. She had stopped embroidering for a man and started embroidering for the world. And there she was again, transforming what she felt into something bigger, more useful, more alive. He didn't look for her. He didn't try to find her again. This woman was no longer the girl in the old apron. She was a force, and he respected that. At night, sitting at the table with his own needle and cloth, he wrote with red thread, slowly. I was blind, I was late, but I was sincere. He folded the fabric. He put it away with the others. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, he felt whole. Not because he was loved, but because he had finally learned to love, without receiving, without expecting, just knowing that it was still possible. His life moved at a new pace, almost strange for someone who had always lived surrounded by haste and appearances. Now everything was slower, simpler, more present. He began to walk aimlessly, go into small bookstores, sit in empty cafes to people watch. He began to see what had previously been invisible, the tiredness in the eyes of the cashier, the tenderness in the gesture of the man who was adjusting his son's blanket on the bus, the silent strength of the women who held the world together with calloused hands. For the first time he felt part of real life, and it was in this new perspective that he found her features scattered in unlikely places without looking for them. In a craft store, he saw a handkerchief on display with the phrase, "Not all silence is absence, sometimes it is healing." He asked the saleswoman where it came from. From a cooperative in the countryside, a woman started it, teaching embroidery as therapy. Now they sell it all over the country. In a pediatrician's office, there was a picture framed with a simple fabric that read, "All pain can become beauty if sewn with patience." In a TV documentary, he saw a brief report about women who transformed trauma into art, and among the quick images, she appeared, just for a second, but enough to know that she was okay. Her eyes were different now, stronger, more serene, as if she knew the weight she was carrying, but no longer allowed it to determine her path. These sudden appearances touched him, like signs, like messages left on the corners of the world, and he began to write down every sentence he came across. He made a notebook with them all. It wasn't a diary, nor a confession. It was gratitude, a way of keeping what he could no longer have, but which, even so, transformed who he was. The woman he had let slip away didn't follow him, but she taught him, from a distance, unintentionally, just by existing. On a cloudy Sunday, he went to the cemetery in the big city where his father was buried. He hadn't been there in years. He took simple flowers and his notebook with phrases. He sat down next to the grave, read a few out loud, and then spoke to his father. "I lived as you taught me. But I discovered that there is another way. A way that we don't learn in big houses. We learn from those who clean, from those who keep quiet, from those who love, and then turn their faces away." He cried there, without shame, because now crying was a way of purifying, not of weakness. Before leaving, he placed the notebook inside a wooden box and buried it discreetly next to the grave. It was his way of leaving a part of himself there, of the man he had been, of the man he no longer wanted to be. On the way back, she passed a square where children ran around with embroidered cloths tied around their necks, like hero capes. Each one had a phrase. She smiled. She thought about how she had won without shouting, without proving anything, defeated simply by being. And it was then that she understood. She had loved him in silence, but she loved herself more when she decided to leave. Months passed, and he never tried to see her again, not out of cowardice, but out of respect. She had traced a path that did not ask for spectators, and he understood that sometimes the greatest proof of love is not crossing the line between memory and presence. Still, she was in everything, in the delicacy with which he now folded her shirt, in the care with which he chose his words, in the new habit of listening more than speaking. In every small gesture there was a part of her, and he began to carry this not as pain but as a seed, because where before there was absence, now there was transformation. One evening, during a cultural event in the city centre, he saw a simple booth surrounded by women of different ages, scarves hung on strings like flags, and at the top of the tent, a hand-embroidered banner read, "Sewn stories heal what the world ignores." He stopped. He observed every detail. He recognized the stitches, the style. It was her project. Even without seeing her, he knew. One of the girls approached, offered him a piece of fabric and asked, "Do you want to leave a sentence of yours?" He smiled out of the corner of his eye. He picked up the needle and thread. He sat down. He no longer trembled as before. Now he knew how to guide the thread. And he wrote, patiently weaving it. "The woman I lost taught me how to find myself." He folded the cloth. He handed it to her. He didn't say his name. The girl read it, looked at him with silent respect and tied the handkerchief to the string, among many others. He walked away slowly, certain that his story no longer needed to be spoken in order to exist. It was there, sewn between lives, between hands that had no idea of its origin. And that was enough. At home, I began a new embroidery. It took longer. It was bigger. A raw cloth was spread out on the table, where I decided to write, in small stitches, everything I had never been able to say out loud, not to her, to myself. It was a slow process which I did in silence at night, with soft music and a calm heart. Each night, a passage, a thought, a regret transformed into a lesson. That was more than a handkerchief. It was an intimate testament. One day, as he finished a long sentence, he leaned back in his chair, looked at the cloth, and realized that he was no longer crying. It no longer hurt. The pain now had shape, color, and meaning. It was beauty. That came from what was lost. It was living proof that love, even when rejected, can become something immense, something that touches, that guides, that remains, even when the person is no longer there. She looked out the window. The night was calm and the wind carried the smell of wet earth. Outside, the world went on, oblivious to the man embroidering in the dark. But inside, in that house that had been so empty, there was now light, not from the lamps, but from her memory, alive in every stitch, in every pause, in every silent beginning. In the spring of that year, he completed the embroidery. It was a large, discreet piece of cloth, unframed, untitled. In it, he sewed everything he had not had the courage to write on paper, his failures, his fears, the truth about what he felt, and the silence he chose out of cowardice. He did it not out of regret, but out of liberation. He folded the fabric with the same care she had once taken when folding the white handkerchief with his initials. And then, for the first time, I knew that the story was complete, closed, not forgotten, but closed with honor. That same week, a letter arrived. No return address. Recycled paper envelope, light handwriting. Inside was a small clipping from a local newspaper. Traveling embroidery exhibition comes to town. Below the title, a brief note. The project that began with a single scarf now travels the country with stories embroidered by anonymous women. One of them, the founder of the initiative, will be present to embroider live. Nothing else, no name. But he knew. He felt it in his body. It was her. On the day of the exhibition, he arrived early. The room was simple, decorated with clotheslines and frames made of recycled wood. Each handkerchief on display told a story. Losses, new beginnings, silenced pain, memories of mothers, sisters, daughters. He walked slowly through the aisles, touching the fabrics with respect. And then he saw her. In the back, sitting at a table, surrounded by children and women, she was embroidering, with the same calm manner as before. Her hair was now lighter, her eyes more mature, but her soul intact. He stopped. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, watching. She seemed happy, not the blatant happiness of someone who has won, but the deep peace of someone who has understood her place in the world. One of the children next to her asked her something, and she smiled, leaning in to show him the right spot. He closed his eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath, and he knew he didn't need to say anything else. Before leaving, she left an envelope with the curator of the exhibition. Inside was the cloth she had embroidered over the last few months, her silent testament. No signature, just a small note tied with red thread. If she ever wants to know if it was worth loving in silence, tell her she changed someone's world. And he left. He didn't look back. He didn't expect an answer. Months passed. One grey morning, while Sorting through old books at home, he found a package on his doorstep. No identification. Inside was a handkerchief. Small, white. In the corner, embroidered with gold thread, just this. It was never too late. But now it is peace. He sat on the floor. He smiled. And he cried as if he had finally understood. There was no reunion. There was no need. Because in that stitch, there was everything. Forgiveness, the end, and the rarest kind of love. The one that becomes a legacy. He took the handkerchief, placed it over the first one he had received years ago, and hung them side by side on the living room wall. There, without a frame, without a caption, just fabric and truth. And everyone who entered his house saw the handkerchiefs, but few asked questions. Those who did heard only one sentence from him. It was love, not the one I experienced, but the one she had the courage to embroider. And so, with a piece of cloth and a patched sole, he went on. Not as a man who lost a woman, but as a man who learned from her silence and never stopped seeing. If this story touched you in any way, leave your comment, so that more people find this silent message. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that speak straight to the heart. Write in the comments, I also sewed in silence, and let's build together a space of healing and truth. And now, watch the video that is appearing on your screen. He carries another story that can transform your perspective. You will understand why.